Welcome, everyone. I'm Rachel Sturman. I'm excited to welcome you to today's event. This event is part of the Urban History Month, which is a project of the Urban History Association. If you're not a member of the UHA, we hope you'll consider joining today. And I'm going to be posting a link to our membership page in the chat in just a few moments. So I am the co-chair of the programming committee. My fellow co-chair, Constance Wise, is also here today. And we are representing this newly formed committee whose goal is to increase opportunities for building intellectual community among the UHA's members. So we're especially eager to increase conversation and connections between scholars studying the US and those studying other parts of the world, particularly cities of the global South. Today's event is the second of two events we've been hosting as part of the UHA's Urban History Month. And the UHA has many more Urban History Month events coming up, which are all free to attend. And I'll be posting the full calendar in the chat as well. So for now, before I introduce the participants in today's event, I just want to take a moment to encourage you to share any programming ideas or events that you might have or you might want to see the UHA put on over the course of the year. So the programming committee exists responding to members' desires for more programming. So we want to be developing the programming that you want. So I'll be putting my email in the chat as well. So please do contact me offline with any ideas you may have. So now turning to today's event on minoritized communities and urban formation, a comparative conversation. We are super fortunate to have two dynamic professors discuss their recent and forthcoming books. First, Juned Shaikh, who's an associate professor of history at UC Santa Cruz, will be discussing Outcaste Bombay, City Making and the Politics of the Poor, which is out from University of Washington Press earlier this year. And Mike Amezcua, assistant professor of history at Georgetown, will be discussing Making Mexican Chicago from Postwar Settlement to the Age of Gentrification, which is forthcoming from University of Chicago Press early next year. And then in conversation with both of those scholars, we have two eminent scholars who are also based at Georgetown. We have a little bit of a Georgetown cabal. Marcia Chatelain, professor of history and American studies, and Ananya Chakravarti, associate professor of history, will each be commenting on one of the two books, and then we will have a broader discussion and then open it up for questions. And you should be able to click on the Q&A tab below to submit your questions. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Juned, who will be talking about, telling us a little bit about Outcaste Bombay.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for attending this panel, that too on a Saturday morning. I know how busy Saturday mornings can be. I'll share my screen and I'll show you some slides. I have a time limit of 8 minutes, so I'll keep to that. I'll stick to that. Just a minute, I'll just. Outcaste Bombay really developed from my interest first as a reporter on labor issues in Bombay. I was reporting on many things, but one of the things that I was asked to report on was some of the labor protests that were happening. I'm talking about the early 2000s, late 99, early 2000. And that's when I realized that I have no understanding of the history of labor in the city. I'm not from Bombay City, actually. And so that ignited my interest in labor history of Bombay. And then from labor history of Bombay, I slowly also simultaneously developed an interest in the history of caste in the city. Then the central question that I tried to address in the book was, what is the history of caste in Bombay City? Now, the history of caste in Bombay City the thesis of the book, I'll just go to the next slide, sorry. The thesis of the book is that capitalism in Bombay city attached itself to caste and made it a part of its made it a part of its metabolic system. So in a sense, capitalism, industrial capitalism, leached on caste. And why do I say it leached on caste? Because if you wanted to start an industry, and in this case, it's the cotton textile industry in Bombay. If you want to start a cotton textile industry, you need capital for the industry. In late 19th and early 20th century are still colonial times. There are no nationalized banks that are offering you credit to start an industry. So one would raise capital through your caste and kinship network to start an industry. And these are Bombay merchants who had made some of their money in the opium trade with China. And they are then trying to start an industry because their returns from the opium trade are now declining towards the end of the 19th century. Right? Now you have started an industry, but you also need labor, right? And you need lots of labor and cheap labor. Right? So how do you recruit a labor force? You recruit your labor force by employing jobbers or foremen, and who then went across the hinterland and recruited labor from their own caste and kinship networks. Right? So in order to start an industry and then to recruit cheap labor, you depended on caste networks. And that's why I'm saying that capitalism attached itself to caste. Right? So you recruit labor, you discipline labor, because the foreman jobber is also tasked with the job of disciplining labor. They also are tasked with the job of getting them housing and or offering them credit in times of need, etc. So even reproducing labor. Right? This, of course, to talk about caste in the city is easier said than done in South Asian history. Until recently, there are only a few works that have spoken about caste in the city. And the labor historians have addressed this question, but they haven't gone in depth. And that's where I took my cue, and then I extended that line of argument forward. But the perception is that in the city, caste disappears. So some of the eminent sociologists in South Asia, including this person called M. N. Srinivas, said that there is not enough material to study caste in urban India. The assumption is that caste gets diluted or disappears, or people shed their caste. And if caste did remain, some practices of caste did remain, like untouchability, for instance, social reformers will get into the act, and then they will tackle these practices of caste, either by reforming the subjects or outcasts or Dalits, or by tweaking some of the practices of the upper caste who may have some prejudices. And that would be interdining, would be one way of reforming caste. Right? But of course, as the book makes the argument, the reality, of course, exceeded that perception of castelessness. If you start looking at it, caste is around, but it's not easily visible. And the argument of the book is that, because it's caste is not easily visible because it's really hiding in plain sight. The two sides that I explore are the built environment, and which also includes questions like housing, and I'll explain a little bit when I give you the breakdown of some of the chapters of the book, and language. And the language that I study, of course, is the language of Marxism, of class. And I see that if you explore even that language of first class inequality, and then after the revolution, a classless society, if you even explore that language, you'll see the presence of caste all around. Right? So in these two sides, I see that I argue that caste and class are entangled. So class, I'm saying, is absolutely very important in understanding Bombay city, and in understanding the history of caste too. And a lot of the book is talking about this entanglement of caste and class in Bombay city. As I was saying, access to jobs, etc., are dependent on this, or dependent on your caste and kinship network. Outcasts, or these are outcasts or who now prefer to call themselves Dalits, untouchables, Dalits. Outcasts are really out of the hierarchy of what is called the Varna hierarchy. They're part of the caste system, but out of the Varna hierarchy. That's why they are called outcasts. Right? So I focus on the outcasts or Dalits, but many of the Dalits are poor in the city, or most of the Dalits are poor in the city. So in order to understand Dalits, it's also important to understand it's a poverty and class in Bombay city. They mostly worked in either in low-paying jobs in the textile industry or in municipal departments or sanitation departments, construction sites, etc. Right? And they lived either if they could find private tenements who would rent a room to them, either they lived there if they found it, or because often they were denied a room in tenement, they lived in slums. And this is what economist called A.R. Bernard Hurst noticed in 1925. This is from his book from 1925, published in 1925. So you see tenements in the background and then slums here in the foreground, right? Some of the tenements, if the government had made those, by the government of Bombay had made those tenements, some of those tenements were reserved or were allotted to people belonging to the lower caste or the Dalit castes too. Right? So caste played a role in finding housing, even if it was government housing. Often, either Dalits couldn't afford the rent in these tenements or were denied permission to live in these tenements. People didn't want to live with them. And they lived in these many jerry-built tenements like these or something like this. So the book then starts with this question. The period that I'm studying is from the period from the 1890s to the 1980s, and these are periods of two important periods of urban transformation. 1890s because of the plague epidemic. The solution to the plague epidemic was to get rid of overcrowding some of the slums, etc. And then new institutions were set up in order to do that, including the Bombay Improvement Trust. So I start in the 1890s and address the question of caste and housing, how caste played an important role in housing. And then even Dalits, then when they started lobbying the state, they started lobbying the colonial state in this case, in the name of caste. And some of the demands were heeded if they lobbied in the name of caste. Right? Now, housing and the built environment. Now, if you see, I've said that the caste capitalism has adapted itself to caste or is leeching on caste. Now, many from the 1920s onwards, the labor movement in Bombay is dominated by some of the Marxists, and some of the Marxists had to then address the question, of course, of class inequality. But Marxists are trying to mobilize workers who are, of course, also outcasts, right? And Marxists, they, in order to address the, demonstrate their relevance to understanding labor issues in South Asia, are translating Marxism, right? So translation is an important theme that you'll see throughout the book. So this translation of Marxism, which is they're trying to make Marxism relevant to India in the and Bombay, particularly in the 1920s and 30s. So in the question of translating Marxism, I look at how categories are translated. And one of the arguments of that chapter is that when it comes to translating abstract categories like surplus value, etc., you see the concepts that are used are derived from the upper register of Marathi. I'm talking about translations from English to Marathi, or Sanskritized Marathi, words that have come from the original Sanskrit and were adapted to the Marathi language. So I get into the politics of language there too, the language of Marathi, the politics of translation. And when it comes to translating categories from the embodied categories, like the lumpen proletariat, for instance, which is an example, because lumpen proletariat later on is also translated as the slum proletariat by Marxists in the 1920s and 1930s. And later on gets translated as Dalits in the 1960s and 70s. So lumpen proletariat and those concepts that are used are from the lower register or often from the urban slang. Right? Now, when it comes to the question of housing and slums, one of the ways in which the state, the municipal corporation, and the state addresses that question is through urban planning. Right? And the plan is to stop industrialization of Bombay. That would stop the number of workers, etc. And then over a period of time to push the workers and the urban poor out of the city by getting rid of some of the industries from Bombay city, which eventually happens in the 1980s. Right? But this sites of these slums are also the sites of politics of the Dalit communities, either the Marxist movement or their participation in the Ambedkarite movement. Ambedkar was an important leader of the Dalits and the chairman of the committee that drafted India's constitution, independent India's constitution. And it's also the site where many of the Dalit writers grew up, engaged with all these various currents that I was talking about, and created a body of literature known as Dalit literature. Right? So chapter 4 talks about the lineage of Dalit literature, which goes in one way, traces it back to some of them are invoking the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. Of course, African-American literature becomes an important inspiration for some of the Dalit writers of the 60s and 70s. Right? And then eventually even Maoism. But even these Dalit writers are suspended in a field of power and are also themselves complicit in some of the power games that come with literature. So Dalit writers want recognition for a field of literature called Dalit literature. They want this recognition from the literati and awards from the government. And that suspends them in a field of power. And chapter 5 talks about that field of power and some of the contradictions there. Many of these writers started the Dalit Panther movement. So they're also involved in Dalit literature and the Dalit Panther movement, as the name suggests, inspired by the Black Panther movement. I can answer questions later on if you have any questions. And then these contradictions eventually, of course, many of the, there are fissures within the Dalit Panther movement. There are fissures, of course, within Dalit literature. And by the 1980s, Marxism, which was already a trend that was declining among Bombay laborers, even the Bombay labor movement and the stream of Marxism within it starts declining by the 1980s, when there is first there is a youth strike, of course. And that's a moment in which people thought that this will be a new beginning now for the labor movement. But that strike went on for 18 months. And at the end of the strike, the mill owners in Bombay decided that it's really better to sell off the mill lands and make huge profits out of those mill lands than to continue with production there. And that's where the book ends with the strike of 1984, at least the substantive chapters end with the strike of 1984. And after 1984, Bombay's urban landscape is transformed into, over a period of time by the 1990s, into, of course, posh residential complexes and shopping malls. And when I was asked to report in the late 90s and early 2000s, that's the concept, that's the context in which I had entered. And that's where I had started off then thinking that I should think about these things historically and then all that. So that's what a brief outline of the book. Yeah? So let me stop here.
Thank you so much, Juned, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. I feel a little bit of an interloper in this conversation. I'm actually an early modernist by training, and so this is at least temporally very far from my usual beat, if you will. But I'm so delighted to be part of this conversation, and especially, I mean, It's funny because Bombay is a city I've never lived in. I have lived in Chicago. And so it was really exciting to actually spend some time thinking about these cities that both intrigue me and at least in the case of Chicago, has been home for a while. I want to begin with, talking about the invisibility or the invisibilization of caste. I mean, we're right now in this moment, where probably the most consequential labor movement in contemporary India has been going on for a long time, and we just had a lynching of a Dalit man in the context of the farmer protest movements. And what is intriguing is the sort of the invisibilization, even in non-urban context, of caste, and there's a complete rejection of the idea that this was actually a form of caste-based violence. So it's a really, really important point that you're making, that the invisibilization of caste, especially in the context of the city, is something that we have to confront and to actually challenge it. And it's still shocking to me that we're the historical profession is only just beginning to really do this in a serious way. What I wanted to really, when I was reading this book, and it is such a delightfully rich book. I mean, so some of this literature I read, some of it was new for me, and the sensitivity with which you read the material is just extraordinary. But for me, the book that it kept bringing to mind was Ángel Rama's La Ciudad Letrada. Which it's really interesting because in a way, of course, Ángel Rama is really giving us a longue durée history of the lettered city in Spanish America. But his final chapter is really almost parallels the kind of process that you're talking about, where he's talking about the splitting up of this elite letrado, which is really the class that kind of semiotically but also materially constitutes the city in colonial America. But then what starts to emerge is, as the sort of democratization process happens, especially with literacy in the 20th century, you start to see a split between the letrados and what he calls the literatos, like the people who hold the soul of the city. And you're starting to see the valorization of sort of folk or working class cultural forms as becoming emblematic, not just of the city, but of the nation, right? So tango being the classic example for Buenos Aires. So there's a really wonderful parallel in a way. Like, so as I was reading this, I was thinking about, Buenos Aires and the way that he's describing it, and Bombay in sort of similar temporal zones. So there's something really interesting about this process that you're marking. And of course, part of that is predicated on the changing access to literacy over the course of this period. But one of the things that really that struck me was the fact that, like, the practice of reading and of writing is such a social practice. Now, I mean, for someone who works on the early modern period, obviously Marathi literature is created in these contexts where the oral and written form coexist. And of course, the publicness of Marathi literature is a long-standing feature. But what's really interesting is that you completely show us a totally different side. So, like, I was just really taken by the descriptions of these working class libraries, attempts to create spaces for reading. And, Arun Kumar's work also came to mind as kind of the, but I was also thinking about, the ways in which there are sort of public places where you go and read newspapers, for example, on the roadsides in cities in Maharashtra, right? Which is still a public practice. And part of that is actually to show that you read. And so there's a really interesting thing that's going on here, which I wanted to kind of draw attention to, which was this notion of what is the status that reading as a practice really provides within this new kind of politics that's emerging in Bombay City. The second thing that I wanted to draw attention to, and again, this connects very nicely with Mike's book as well, and of course it follows really well from Sheetal Chahapriya's brilliant book on Bombay as well, which is this circulation between the rural and the urban, and the ways in which the the constitution of the city itself is happening at this frontier between the rural and the urban. Sheetal Chhabria, of course, describes this as a kind of colonization of the rural frontier by the city. But here, what I'm intrigued by is these migratory patterns. So for me, for example, the term Mawali was really, really fascinating because, as you pointed out, it refers to actually people from the kind of Ghat areas. Now, there's a very similar term in Goa where I work, which is like, the use of the term Ghati, which also shows up in Marathi outside of Bombay, I guess, as a context to kind of refer to sort of migrant labor. And it's pejorative. It has associations with Blackness. It has associations with, all kinds of sort of like caste discriminatory practices as well, right? But here, there's a really interesting tension between this kind of geographical outsider of the Mawali, who then becomes absolutely constitutive of the city's politics, whether it's being cast as a kind of lumpen proletariat, or in some ways, as the radical literature of the 70s reclaims the figure of the Mawali as really the quintessential Bombaygar, right? Like, so there's something really interesting happening with that migratory pattern, especially with then Dalit Panthers going back to villages to intervene in caste politics there. So I wanted to ask you to, reflect a little bit more on what that cycle is. And the last thing that really struck me is, of course, how cosmopolitan all of this is. And it's cosmopolitan in every sense. I have a paper that I've been trying to write for a while on like why Marathi is a global language in the 17th century. But I mean, by the time you're writing this, what is extraordinary, whether it's Marxist literature or whether it's Dalit literature, Marathi is bringing together really ideas from all over the place, whether it's Russia or African American literature, and part of it again, though, what I'd like you to reflect on is that cosmopolitanism is not just circulation of ideas of books, but it's actually also tied to material circulation of migration. Again, from my period, sort of thinking back to the 17th century, the beginnings of the constitution of Bombay City, after it's taken over by from the Portuguese. I mean, the East India Company is bringing laborers in from all over the world to basically supply their labor needs in this factory town, and it's enslaved labor, and it's coming from all over the place. And the Portuguese were also doing this even before. So I mean, my work shows, like, for example, the fishing communities along that coast were being constantly slave raided by the Portuguese. So there's a very long history of global circulation of people. So like the African ruffian and Bagel's story, he's not just a figure like it's not an imaginary figure. It's a figure that you could actually come across. And what's intriguing to me is that you have an actual African who has there's every possibility of a realist reason why he would end up in Bombay, in a chawl in Bombay. But the way that Marxists then describe the figure of the African is using this kind of a language of the Siddhi, which is, of course, this very strange kind of choice, which again harkens to this image of the Siddhi as this kind of, this royal slave and like a figure of power. But then it's just a very strange kind of inability to then content with Blackness within these politics. So I'll stop there, and I have so much more to ask you to think about, but I think I've at least hopefully started the conversation in a way that's productive.
No, thank you so much, Ananya, and thank you for reading the book. I mean, it's wonderful questions and wonderful engagement with the books. You've gone into some of the nitty-gritties, which I assume probably nobody will ever get into it or get to it. No, thank you so much. Right. So yeah, I'll start with and you said Angel Ramos, right? Yeah.
Angel Rama.
Okay.
The Lettered City. If you haven't read it, it's a classic of Latin American theory, and it's fabulous.
I mean, I'm always looking for book recommendation, and this is great. First, I just wanted to sort that out. Lettered City, okay. Okay, great. Yeah, the invisibility of caste, of course, is it's a big question. It's a big thing, and particularly in urban spaces, the question of invisibility of caste, it's central, as you're saying, even in rural spaces, and there are many contradictions to the current upsurge in the agrarian upsurge in India. Caste, of course, is just one of the contradictions. The question was, what explained this inability to address caste in the city when it was around, right? I mean, the upper caste, for instance, many of the people, as I was saying, you started industries with your caste network. Many of the people belonging to upper caste found houses because the government of Bombay allowed cooperative housing society, and caste was the basis for allowing cooperative housing societies. Of course, Frank Conlon, but also Nikhil Rao have spoken how caste and then class are very important. And many middle class but upper caste people then constructed these cooperative housing societies and got housing through that. And you see all this evidence, of course. I've also, while doing research, I also found ads from the 1930s, which I didn't end up using in the book, but of caste housing. Right, housing for particular castes. One of them was for Brahmin castes. Right, this is housing for Brahmin castes, and yet there is an inability to address caste, because caste was seen as a problem not of the everyday, but caste was then associated with something spectacular acts of violence, for instance, or spectacular acts of dishonor. And that, in the minds of many people in the city, only happened in the countryside, right? But the everyday caste, where housing, access to jobs, your social network, and marriages, arranged marriages, they all depend on caste network. When caste was around, and yet there was an invisibility or inability to address this caste, or a question of caste and casteism, because casteism of dishonor and violence is only seen as something in the villages. And then the solution then became that reformers will come and tackle it, and then when reformers are tackling it, they're trying to teach some of the low caste people the tenets of good hygiene and not drinking alcohol, and those were some of the practices of the reformers. And the hope was that through this they will address the question of caste and casteism in some way. And then with the upper caste, if you have interdining practices like interdining among the upper caste and the lower caste, that will address that question. Marxists thought, very centrally, Marxists thought that caste is from the feudal period. Now we have entered this period of modernity. So capitalism has already weakened caste. And then socialism, or after the communist revolution, the socialism that will come will get rid of caste completely. So caste is not a feature of urban life at all, or an important feature of urban life at all. Right. So in a way, they also were not attentive or had invisibilized caste. And yet, as I was saying, caste, capitalism had adapted itself to caste, was deploying caste to break strikes of laborers and all that, not just recruiting laborers, but also deploying caste to break strikes, which will, coming again back to the present, which will also be the practice of the present too. That's how, the solidarities of workers will be broken. It's an easy way to do it, right? I just in the book, and then I tried to show how caste is right. If you just pay attention to it and then just bring it in your research question, the question of caste, if it is addressed in your research question or raised in your research question, then you'll definitely be able to address the history of caste in the city and the history of caste and its entanglement with class in the city. Right. The Dalits were were insistent that class and caste are separate. Right. They're separate experiences. So the classic case of class would be that because we are all because we're all being surplus value is being extracted out of our labor, and because all of us are therefore are have to are part of this regime of extraction of labor, and therefore making surplus value. That class is the only feature that is important. But Dalits were insistent because, but see, there are our experiences of caste, and we have experienced caste. We, through our long history, we have figured out ways of raising this question of caste through literature, through various other means, or by the 19th century through social movements, modern social movements. And there was insistence that caste and class, you can't fold them together, right? At various moments, we'll come together and we'll form solidarities and alliances, but the caste is a different experience, and they were hoping that the Marxists would raise this question and recognize this, right? Address this question. That never happened, right? Or at least a long sustained.
I'm just going to jump in.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Juned. This is so fascinating. I'm just going to jump in and have us shift gears so we have enough time to have Mike and Marcia's presentations and also have time for a broader conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, no, welcome.
Mike, if you wouldn't mind going ahead, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I'm gonna try to share my screen here, and let's see. Can you all see that? Okay. Okay, and then I'm gonna time myself so that I just don't go over too much. But let me just start off by thanking Rachel and Constance and Hope and the Urban History Association and all of you for being here. It's really wonderful to be in dialogue with all of you, with Juned, with Ananya and Marcia, and to talk about my book that has been way too long in the making, embarrassingly so. So it's good to finally have it be off my desk. My book, Making Mexican Chicago, was guided really by a kind of central question about what kinds of systems or structures of power were embedded in the built environment that conditioned and constrained the lives of Mexicans, both immigrants and US born. And I really wanted to understand how city infrastructure or the politics of planning, for instance, or redevelopment interacted with a kind of migrant personhood or a kind of racial alienage that followed brown bodies, Mexican bodies throughout the city. And so in thinking about this question and then trying to answer it, I decided that I had to kind of show the way that these two twin projects of kind of urban renewal and moments of the kind of immigration enforcement regime in the form of deportation campaigns intersected and overlapped. Mostly here, I'm talking about the mid-century period, and specifically deportation campaigns like Operation Wetback in 1954, which there's a ton of great scholarship on it, but I really wanted to tell the urban history of the operation itself, right? And shift away from LA and the Southwest and into Chicago, and how enclaves of Mexican community spaces became targets of both of these state projects in overlapping ways. So, something that kind of guided my thinking around this was thinking about shadows and thinking about, people that live in the shadows of urban spaces and then losing those shadows because you lose those buildings, right? The removal of buildings, what is left for marginalized communities, immigrant communities, communities of color, when that happens. And so I argue that this moment is central for the ways in which Mexicans will then define the varied politics of belonging and community making in the city from that point forward, right? So my book is primarily concerned with the southwest side of Chicago, an area that becomes that comes to have a really strong presence of Mexicans, right? Mexicanos, Mexicanas, and in thinking about these areas, this is a map here of the southwest side of Chicago and its various communities in which Mexicans come to really form a strong base, right? I wanted to ask questions about Latinx segregation, how it functioned, in particular in Chicago, a city that has long been concerned with Black containment, right, and really segregating Black Chicagoans during and even prior to, but really during the Great Migration period, and that kind of landscape of segregation premised on Black containment comes to affect Mexican containment as well. And so the way I show that story is by really moving to the back of the yards. So the community on the southern end of my map here, to show how Latinx segregation functioned, not through some kind of course, legal apparatus, which even by the late 40s would have been outlawed for anybody, right? Shelley v. Kramer, but really through kind of ethnic white community councils that begin to really resent both municipal politics and state politics for what they see as people that politics that are not functioning in their best interests, right? So they then have to mobilize their own kind of enclosures of minorities, of communities of color, in ways that are kind of extra legal, right? We historians have done really a good job of charting out the kind of racial violence that kept African Americans from moving into certain neighborhoods. But I show a kind of more intimate base of relations between ethnic white community leaders and Mexican American community leaders, right? To kind of respect boundaries through boulevards and streets, and to negotiate the kind of what I call the unstable vacancies of white flight. So, through examples of housing, of real estate, of urban planning and community control, the book really tries to show how Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans come to shape and struggle and engage with economic development of their communities, right? So I'm looking at the second half of the 20th century, roughly the 1940s to about the end of the 1990s. I'll just kind of talk through some of these slides here. This image on the right here is in the near west side as a young boy sees the demolition of an entire neighborhood to build new civic centers, a university, and therefore pushes or causes a form of decentralization of the Mexican community. Just to give you a sense of the workings of the book, I talked about the twin projects of urban renewal and Operation Wetback. That's really in chapter 2. But before that, I kind of lay out the stakes of the work and thinking about the kind of deliberate project of making Mexican Chicago, right? So actual like kind of movers and shakers, kind of people that deliberately made space for Mexicanization, and in the process kind of made markets for Mexicanization, right? So that's chapter one, really the intro. Chapter two is these twin projects of really a kind of displacement and deportation that affects the kind of thinking and politic making of Mexican people in the city. Chapter three is really about the back of the yards and the kind of racial enclosures that are, as I mentioned earlier, made by white ethnic councils in tandem with political power, right? So in tandem with the political machine of Chicago. Just for the sake of time, I'll move really quickly. The making of the Brown Bungalow Belt is, again, if we go back to this Southwest side map, really the kind of movement Southwest side of Mexicans as they make way into what are really hostile and defensive ethnic white communities in the process of white flight, right? So that's what chapter four takes on. Chapter five is really about the moment in which, and here I think I have some overlap with Juned in that I talk about the urban planning regime and the kind of bottom-up barrio planners of Mexican communities that challenge that planning regime and then attempt to use federal dollars to remake the barrio, essentially. And then it ends with chapter six, which is flipping colonias, which I look at kind of neoliberal investment in Mexican neighborhoods in the 1980s and 90s, and the struggle that various Mexican American organizations and stakeholders kind of take on to either accommodate neoliberal dollars or to challenge them or really resist the kind of neoliberal intrusion of nonprofits and corporate money into kind of branding Mexican neighborhoods. So I'll kind of leave it at that because I'm already at 9 minutes or so. But I'm happy to answer any questions any of you might have as to the workings of the book. So thank you so much.
So I had the pleasure of reading Mike's book a couple months ago, and there's so much here that I'm just going to say briefly, and then I know we're going to open up to the conversation. One of the things that makes this book such an important contribution, not only to urban history, but to Latinx studies, is its ability to really address the institutions that we have marked as problems in the lives of people.
Concession from the machine or from the state, etc. And that revolt at the end, the way in which Mike describes it, at the end, Pilsen is getting ready to get gentrified. So all that, there is a revolt and revolution is invoked, and things have changed a little bit, but that it's changed. They are still suspended in a field of power, and it's there is gentrification looming at the end there, right? Because they've been able to set up an art council, etc., all that. Right? So that was the invocation of revolt, revolution was another parallel that I also saw and I found fascinating in Mike's book too. And it's the same period, actually. It's the 1960s and 70s, the global 1960s and 70s that I talk about in the later part of the book. It's the same period. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I definitely saw that parallel with the invocation of revolt and revolution, the really lofty goals of these revolutionaries, right, in your book and in my book. The paper trail they leave behind to paint a picture and really articulate a new vision, but then what the outcomes are so different. And at least for me and in my book, you know, these are organizations that for one reason or another, but mainly because of the changing kind of political economy that they're dealing with, right? And here I'm thinking about Pilsen Neighbors Community Council, and then later the United Neighborhood Organization. They've got a lot of items on their menu that they're trying to attack, and within the community, they're actually already being criticized for focusing on one neighborhood rather than thinking larger about the kind of post-industrial neighborhoods that Latinos have to grapple with. And so in that process, right, of juggling a lot of things, Pilsen, it becomes another target again of the state and of the redevelopers and the corporate downtown interests that again see a primed real estate for a kind of riverward community, right? A place that can have these luxury apartments, these condos with sailboats, and you know, you've got it's so close to downtown, and so you know, which visions win out? Well, you know, if you go to Chicago today, I mean, that seems to be the vision that's kind of winning right now. So yeah.
I want to just you know, invite our audience to ask questions. I see we have maybe one question in the chat, and other people should feel free to jump in and pose questions. So I can read this question that's just come in. Mike, could you talk about Mexican urban communities in the broader Midwestern context? I'm doing research on Detroit, which also has a longstanding Mexican neighborhood known as Mexican Town that has gradually gotten larger over the years. This is from Matthew Hines.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot of parallels between Detroit and Chicago. You know, the first thing that comes to mind is the expressways, right, and the destruction of Mexican communities, right? Here I'm thinking of Fisher Expressway in Detroit that really divides the neighborhood, and so Mexican Town has to be kind of remade. And similarly in Chicago, a couple of expressways cut through the near west side. You've got the Dan Ryan, you've got the Congress Expressway that destroys like really prime apartment units in which Mexican people lived and made communities, built families. And so when I think about the Midwestern kind of urban Mexican context, I do think about the kinds of afterthoughts that Mexican colonias are, and yet, right, the endurance of these colonias / neighborhoods in reclaiming their sense of belonging, their persevering through different phases of kind of development, redevelopment, disinvestment. But yeah, I mean, the last time I was in Detroit was a few years ago, and you can see that there's a lot of aspects of it that are, well, I'll put it this way: there's places in which there were strong clusters of Mexican communities in the 1950s that really no longer exist, right? The Caste district being one of them. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of parallels. You know, we can broaden that out, I think, to include other cities, but I think that Detroit and Chicago definitely have a close proximity in terms of similar phases of development and disinvestment.
Can I ask Mike just a quick follow-up?
Great, please.
I just, the one thing that you also kind of gesture at towards the end of the book is the political coalitions and its relationship to the election of the first Black mayor in Chicago, Harold Washington. I'm just curious about like where you see Mexican Americans in Chicago benefiting directly from the patronage system of their political loyalties, and how much you think that was tied into property ownership in neighborhoods like Pilsen?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. Yeah, so I cover that formation of the Daily Democrats and their longevity even after Mayor Daley dies, and you got the rise of Harold Washington, Chicago's first Black mayor. Initially, I would say that that the payoff between that relationship between Mexican American business people and the machine is beneficial to them, because they now have access to City Hall, they have access to permits, they have access to a kind of patronage that prior to that relationship, it would have been difficult for Mexicans to have. So in order to in Chicago, even in the 1950s, in order to improve your house or your home, you would have needed a permit. Everything leads back to City Hall, right? So to have a group that is literally situated on the 5th floor of City Hall next to Mayor Daley, which the Latino Daily Democrats were, would have allowed you some certain perks. Now, that eventually goes away because the machine itself gets weaker at the tail end of Mayor Daley's tenure as mayor, partly because of the war on poverty funding that is trying to dislodge the centrality of municipal power. And so this is when you really see that the social movement groups of the 1960s and 1970s, that the hard work that they're laying a foundation for is paying off, right? Pilsen gets a new high school in the late 70s that opens in 1980. That is built because of the push by the grassroots neighborhood groups that are anti-machine, that are fighting the machine, right? So there are some benefits, but there are also some pitfalls there for sure.
You know, that's fascinating. And it makes me think about parallels to the Bombay case. And, you know, especially in the kind of post-colonial era, more recent decades, where, you know, Dalits have been able to kind of mobilize or utilize, you know, their strength in voting in municipal elections in order to lay claim to certain kinds of political power. And I'm wondering, Juned, if you would be interested in commenting on the parallel, or maybe you see more of a contrast.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, right from the 1950s, actually. So, you know, independent India introduces democracy or parliamentary elections, and therefore democracy as a way to transforming the social structure. And that's what even Marxists then agreed to fight elections. And that was the way to do that. One of the things that happens in Bombay in the 1950s is the status of Bombay city itself. Now, should Bombay city become remain independent as, you know, a separate territory, union territory as it was called, or should it become part of the state of Gujarati speakers, Gujarat, or the Marathi speakers, Maharashtra, right? That's where early from the 1950s onwards, Dalit politics then tries to gets involved in this game of supporting political parties and trying to get some concessions out of that. So very early on in the 1950s, this battle for the reorganization or to claim Bombay for the state of Maharashtra, some members of the Dalit political movement end up supporting it in the hope that there'll be certain concessions that will come from that. And it pays dividends early on, because in 1957, the mayor of Bombay is a Dalit mayor, right? And this Dalit mayor was a leader of the sanitary workers union, etc., in the 1940s, and he becomes the mayor. In the long run, it probably doesn't pay off, because, you know, in a state of Maharashtra, the instances of violence against Dalit increases substantially, which Ambedkar had warned Dalits against, actually. He said that something like this may happen. It'll lead to a elite or power in the hands of a few castes who would then exert it through, and instances of violence may increase. So you see the Dalits trying to play the game in Bombay City very early on, being recruited for alliances. They get recruited for supporting strikes, which they do, because many Dalits are also the urban poor. They end up joining the Marxist unions in strikes for a day or two, etc. Right? So these alliances, political alliances, they form. They get a presence in city politics. They have a mayor in the 1950s who puts the agenda of making some slums permanent. That comes up in the 1950s and 60s, right? So there are these gains, and there are these parallels. In the long run, of course, things, don't go as planned, and some slums become durable, many don't. In the state of Maharashtra, the instance of political violence increases, and there are others. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have another question that's come in from Pallavi Rao, who says, many thanks to both for these enlightening talks. I have a question for Juned. Could you speak a little toward the fissures between Ambedkarite movement and the communist groups in the 1970s, which have resulted in some long-term shifts of the working classes towards Maratha ethno-nationalism in the decades that followed? What kind of critical commentaries can be made of urban leftist politics and its failures since that time?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Pallavi. Thank you. I'll just go back just a little bit. So in the 1931 census, when the numbers of people were counted according to the castes, right? The 1931 figures returned that almost 1/3 of the population of Bombay City came from the Maratha caste, and many of them were workers in the textile industry and in other places. So they comprise a substantial portion of labor in Bombay City, 1/3 of the city itself, but as laborers, almost 50-60% in various fields, in cotton, textiles, in docks, etc. Right? That left, according to the census itself, that left a mark on the politics of the city. Right? So from the 1930s onwards, when the Marxists are trying to mobilize workers, they, of course, are confronted with the question of caste, because most of the workers that they are trying to recruit, and Marxists end up recruiting the artisans or the slightly higher paid workers rather than the lower paid workers. Most of the workers that they're trying to recruit are coming from the Maratha caste, right? And you see that in the Marxist union itself from the 1930s, there are practices of caste in the union office itself. One famous case is that for members of the Dalit caste, there are different separate pitchers for drinking water. Right? So you see that from the 1930s. Now this labor movement, Marxist movement, starts declining by the 50s, 60s particularly, and a new ethno-nationalist movement emerges, which in Bombay, of course, is the Shiv Sena, which is now also the ruling party in Maharashtra. And workers from the 60s and 70s, they start shifting to the Shiv Sena, either for patronage, either to make their presence felt in public space, right? And for these reasons, or for some, concessions like getting electricity connection in their house or a water connection in their neighborhood, etc. All these things, they end up shifting to the Shiv Sena. And this, of course, coincides, of course, with the decline of the Marxist movement. And they, till the 60s, they thought of the Marxist movement as somebody that will be able to offer them patronage. Now, the question of caste within the Marxist movement, of course, keeps coming up again and again. And as I was mentioning, there are occasional collaborations in times of strike, or some support during municipal election or even parliamentary elections, where Dalit candidates end up supporting communist parties. Sometimes the Marxists don't end up supporting the communist parties. Because of these interactions by the sometimes failed alliances. By the 1950s, the tensions have, of course, come to the fore. And after Ambedkar's death, there is a period in which many Marxists don't want to engage, many Dalits don't want to engage with the Marxist movement. And many Marxists are not willing to take the conversation on caste forward. And in any case, by the 1960s and 70s, the parliamentary wing of the communism, that is the two big communist parties who embraced parliamentary politics, they started declining in the imagination of many urban radicals, including Dalit radicals. And Maoist movement came to the fore, and Maoists were attentive to the question of caste. That was one of the reasons why in which many Dalit radicals started engaging with the Maoist movement. Of course, this is the era of global, the global 1960s, when Maoism, of course, is the very important idea. Right. So this question of caste, Marxists never end up quite addressing centrally. They have occasional alliances. And that was one of the reasons why then, there are many fallouts. Then there are intellectuals like Sharad Patil, who is disillusioned with both the Marxist movement and joining the Maoist movement, is disillusioned also with the Maoist movement, and then puts up forward a theory of where he thinks caste will come to the fore and will be addressed by Marxists and other groups only if the unconscious, which is anti-caste, becomes the conscious.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
I just want to, thank you. That's so fascinating. I just want to,
sorry.
Go ahead, Ananya.
I just wanted to add, I mean, in some ways you could actually take that genealogy even further back. I mean, most people forget that, like, Lala Lajpat Rai and Tilak were equally sort of important to what became the Hindu nationalist movement, as well as the labor movement. I mean, especially Lala Lajpat Rai and his meetings in Bombay were enormous as well, right? I mean, so there's a long-term twinning between the labor movement and Hindu nationalism that goes back to the 19-teens, really. And I think that longer genealogy is one of the things that is worth keeping in mind when you look at something like the Shiv Sena.
Yeah, and unaddressed genealogy. I mean, I'll just say something very briefly. So one of the most important Marxists in Bombay city is this figure called S.A. Dange, Shripad Amrit Dange.
Sure. And
Shripad Amrit Dange is a fan really, not of Marx, who of course he claims Marx, but really of Tilak. Right? He models himself on Tilak. In his thinking, when he's addressing the question of the history of caste and communism in India, he traces a commune back to the Aryan period. And that idea of the Aryan period is borrowed directly from Tilak, right? The periodization of the period itself is borrowed directly from Tilak, the figure that Ananya was talking about, right?
I mean, even MPT Acharya, he starts by saying it's like Tilak. Tilak's really the guy that they're all looking at. It's not Marx. It's not. He becomes an anarchist in Europe, really. In India, it's Tilak.
Yeah, absolutely. And they don't have many texts on Marx to read in the 1920s and 30s. They really are reading Tilak and then even Dayanand Saraswati. They're reading figures like those. Not much of Marx, because there are not as many texts coming into Bombay, at least in the initial part of Marxism in Bombay. And Shiv Sena is Bal Thackeray is really his hero is Dange. Dange's hero is Tilak. Right, so you can see that lineage. You can see
the genealogy is.
That genealogy.
Yeah, for sure. So I just wanted to jump in to make sure we have time for one more question. So, so there's another question from Matthew Hines for both of you. So for both of these minority communities, how much does their power at the urban level, albeit limited, flow through democracy, like elections and the like, or rather through various other forms of activism? So I think that's a really interesting way for us to kind of think through. So Mike, if you want to start us off.
That's an excellent question. I would say that for Latinx urban groups in Chicago and Mexicans in particular, it would be more of the kind of other forms of activism that has been probably longer and also maybe more successful. Here I'm thinking of like community control groups, neighborhood rehabilitation groups, groups that are kind of institution building within the neighborhoods themselves. But that's not to say that other forms of politics that were attempting to flow through kind of democratic capital D, like voting or elections and things like that, weren't happening. It's just that, I mean, as early as the 1940s, you've got Mexican Americans that are, and obviously even earlier, but really in the 40s, you've got Mexican Americans that are attempting to become members of local ethnic white political democratic clubs, right? Like Chicago is like is controlled by the Democrats, and so in the near West Side, you've got an Italian American group called the Pete Fazio Democratic Club. Mexican Americans become members of that club, and then eventually they form their own democratic organization. Now, this is really like it's a little bit of, it's like symbolic politics, right? Like they don't have enough numbers really to swing any election, and they're certainly not going to challenge an old time like Democratic alderman or anything like that, but they're still going to perform those kinds of coalition based symbolic acts of politics in order to curry favor with the machine or with an alderman. So that was going on, but I would say that like in terms of deliverables, it would have been the kind of like anti-establishment, neighborhood level, grassroots level organizations. Yeah.
No, yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Matthew. One of the things which minority groups, I guess, realize on, particularly in the case of the Dalit movement in Bombay, in India, in Bombay particularly, is that in order to bring about transformation, you have to capture power, right? State power. Now, state power in an election, in a democracy, as Mike was saying, when the numbers are limited, that becomes difficult. So then you, you then come to certain agreements. Democratic parties of the Dalits, they will come to certain agreements with the state, right? And therefore, then lose credibility in the eyes of Dalits themselves, because in those agreements really are benefiting the leaders. So there is always that tension within the Dalit movement. That's why you see in Dalit movements fissuring. If you form a political party, those political parties in 10 years will have 4 factions. Now, in order to critique a political party, now there is something like the Dalit Panther, which comes up as a political movement, of course. But within 2 years, the Dalit Panther movement also ends up splitting. And within 4 years, it ends up splitting again. And within 5 years, it's almost redundant. And the Dalit Panther movement too ends up lobbying the state to get some benefits for themselves or their constituents. And which is, even the Dalit Panther movement is talking about making slums durable. And that's one of their long-standing achievement, is certain slums in which Dalits live remained slums and were not then demolished or moved out. Only some slums, right? So with democratic politics, there is this it goes both ways. The state figures out ways of co-opting the Dalit movement or minority movements. And then the state, and then when the Dalits put up some other radical movement, figures out a way of breaking them and co-opting them too. Right? And then, of course, then a new movement comes up. And in this moment, there'll be a new movement, which will invoke the earlier radical movement. So at the moment, there are radical movements too. So yeah, so.
Marcia, I wanted to invite you if you had any other questions.
May I ask a question?
Oh, sure, go
Um,
ahead.
to both of them, and it's actually it's a sign of like how generative for me these two books were, especially reading them together, that it actually made me go back to like sort of really foundational questions, whether of like the Marx versus Weber debate about class.
Right.
Because there's something really fascinating with, you know, thinking about the ethnicization that's going on in Chicago, and then with caste in Bombay, and the larger question that it poses about the category of class altogether, right? And so I'd love to hear from each of you, like sort of, because there's so much rich empirical data that you're providing in sort of thinking about, especially embodied experience that cannot be reduced to class. Whether it's the, you know, the deportation and the violence of immigration control in Chicago, or the kind of everyday constant humiliation that is excessive beyond the necessity of extracting labor in Bombay, right? So I kind of wanted to like hear from both of you, like this super basic question, but it's worth kind of revisiting in light of these two books.
No. Do you want to go, Mike, or shall I start?
I'll just say a few things about that, because I agree with Ananya about that striking connection there. I especially when you talk about language and how language will actually reveal so much about that particular person's socioeconomic, caste, and class position. I don't look at language, but I am sensitive to that form of stigma and stigmatization, and how you show the Dali being stigmatized. I try to be sensitive to that in my own work to kind of carry it through different eras of the late 20th century, but really to think about how if you're a Mexican American in 1950s back of the yards, and you're trying to alter or improve your property, and you've got to go to City Hall, how you speak and how you're listened to will determine whether you're going to get something or not, right? And I think that in that area alone, I found it really striking that kind of connection between stigmatization, language, and how one becomes legible and therefore placed in the larger schema of urban society. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, and thanks, Ananya. And both class and caste, these are categories that get translated, right? For instance, with class, of course, there is this genealogy of what you can trace to social history coming out of the New Left, particularly E.P. Thompson. That experience of belonging to the lower class over a period of time leads to a class identity, right? And then there is, of course, the Weberian way of status ascription, right? And both are, of course, also relevant. So one of the things that I want to point out is the relevance of class in understanding caste groups too. So even within caste politics, even within caste groups, class intersects, right? Somebody like the figure I'm talking about, Ambedkar's father, for instance, used to work in the British colonial army, right? Has a pension, has a certain status, and he was very cognizant of drawing a class distinction between that caste group even, or the little caste or jati group that he belongs to, right? So class there is absolutely relevant, and I really want to emphasize the importance of class as an analytical category and as a political category. Caste, of course, has a very longer lineage, right? There is that Varna system, and there's 2,500-year history, even longer. That Varna system and then the Jati system, which are two different things which get then folded into each other. Varna is a fourfold hierarchy. Jati is, of course, multiple, what is translated as subcastes. that Varna system and then Jati system is translated as casta by the Portuguese, and then eventually by the British as caste, right? Of course, the caste and this Jati, there are so many contradictions, right? So many contradictions, including class contradictions that I highlighted. In various regions, there are particularly subcaste groups that dominate. And within those subcaste groups, there are particular class groups or regional groups that end up dominating. So those categories you have to be attentive to in their historical juncture, right?
So
yeah.
No, go ahead. I don't want to cut you off in your sentence, though I know we're at the end of our time. Did you want to finish with just that sentence?
And that's what this book is about, trying to be attentive to some of those distinctions in that particular historical context.
Yeah, right? Yeah. No, this is really wonderful conversation, so generative, and I really appreciate both of you authors for being with us and speaking with us, and both of our commentators, Marcia and Ananya, for your kind of wonderful drawing out of these books. Thank you to everyone who joined us today, and I just want to remind you to check out the other offerings on the Urban History Month. So we have some great things coming up as well. Thank you, everyone. Bye.